Good morning. We have a Pecha Kucha for you, 20 minutes, 20 slides, although it's a little more than 20 slides. What we're doing today is talking about a collection. We're talking about metadata associated with that collection, and we'll be describing future directions that we're hoping to take. The purpose of our presentation is specifically not to talk about a collection, but the collection. In this case, it's the collection called the Huntington Photographic Archive of Buddhist and Asian Art. And we're going to be talking more specifically about the transformations that have taken place between analog format to digital, and then our plans for going forward and thinking more expansively about presentation. The archive is, in this case, an archive which fits within the confines of the symposium because it's intended for teaching and research. There's a history. Every archive has a history. In this case, it's quite deep. It goes back 40 years. The Huntingtons, particularly John and Susan, have been working throughout most of their career in developing this marvelous collection. It's become institutionalized in the mid-1980s at Ohio State University, where both were teaching. And during the intervening years, many of the images were transferred to digital format. They made that movement, maybe in the Tom Mitchell-like fashion or in the fashion that you had suggested, Sumati, into a digital form. The next motion is going to be to the University of Chicago. The entirety of the collection is going to be shifting soon to the University of Chicago's library. With any project of this magnitude, as you would imagine, there's a deep and long history of funding. Ohio State has provided enormous and initial funding, but then that was built upon productively by the Huntingtons over time with a generous support from the U.S. government, the Department of Education, National Endowment for the Humanities, Crest Foundation, and most recently we have support from the Luce Foundation. On to some images. These are the stars, from my perspective, of the Huntington collection, John and Susan. John, I think many of you know, is trained as a professional photographer. Both John and Susan have wonderful backgrounds as trained art historians. But what I think is really important is that they've brought an ethnographic sensibility in addition to their art historical training to their project, careful note-taking, etc. From the very beginning, graduate students have been involved. Teaching has been a component of the work, and so graduate students have gone with them on numerous trips into the subcontinent, helping to photograph, but additionally to take notes on what it is that's being collected through the camera. It's wide-ranging, and this map will give you a sense for the broad geographic spread. The yellow areas, as noted here, identify the regions from which photographs have come. They're well-traveled folk. If we take a look at a summary of the images, this is far too much for you to digest, but let me just point to India, draw your attention to India, and say that India, that 150,000 images, accounts for more than half of the photographs in the entirety of the Huntington collection. Or if we move on to South Asia, more broadly put, beyond just India, we'll see that there are 2,200,000 images. That in total is about 75% of the collection. Well, let's take a look at a few of the images. It's been going for a long time as a project, the development of the Huntington Archive. And not surprisingly, much of the photography from the earlier period is in black and white. Here are a couple of examples. Now, I think you will have recognized that the title of this collection is the Huntington Photographic Archive of Buddhist and Asian Art. Somehow, for me, it's appropriate to start with images that are not Buddhist. I think many of you will recognize the Kandarya Mahadev Temple in Khajuraho as an image depicted here, along with a pattern that you'll see persistent through the following slides. That is, that there's a detail, in this case, a bracket. Well, we move beyond the black and white, and that's a very large number of the photos, to color. And following that same pattern I mentioned with the previous slide in the deck, you'll see that in this case, we have wonderful imagery, really sharp, clear, professional imagery of the Sanchi Stupa, a detail of the Torna, and then a detail of the detail from the Torna. Or if we move on further, we take a look at persistent pattern here of large image of a particular object, in this case a sculpture that came Shakyamuni from Sarnath, 5th century, and then careful attention to the detail. This really allows for wonderful perception of what's going on within a sculpture or a larger monument. We go well beyond simply in this collection Buddhist and Hindu representations. In this case, the Taj is very nicely there. We've got the Gateway of India and Apollo Bandar. Most of you, I suppose, will have visited that. And then modern architecture as well. So a really broad-ranging and Catholic perspective on what imagery should be. We have before and after, sadly. In this case, the Bamyan Buddha, taken during the Huntington's visit, represented by this overarching view, which many of you will be familiar with, but additionally, very large numbers of photos in the small niches at the time prior to destruction. And then, of course, sadly, the empty space. Fortunately, not all the spaces are empty. The Buddha still stands in different places. In this case, I think very nicely represented by one of the image houses in Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka, or another example from Sri Lanka, Dambulla Cave number 3. It is Buddhist in many ways, and so it's not surprising that the Himalayan range has great representation within the Huntington Archive. We start off here with a few images that are from Nepal, the Badrinath Stupa in Kathmandu. Additionally, we switch gears, drop a little bit to the south of Kathmandu into Patan, and we have the Kwabala, or the Golden Temple. The Tara images from Nepal and a Nepali in praxis. If we move outside of Nepal, but staying in the Himalayan range, they've traveled widely. They had their own passports. Mitchell would have been happy for this, I suppose. They carried their camera, and the camera was portable, as well as the images they created being portable. But here we are in Bhutan, if we start off in the far left side, and it's the iconic, well-known Tatsung monastery, or the Tiger's Nest. Interesting imagery that comes from a Bhutanese temple in Bodh Gaya, and I won't go on with the details. Alchi is represented. And importantly, it's not just static objects, but it is also people in their practices. This is well represented, and here again, I think the ethnographic eye that they've brought to their work is really powerful and creates a wonderful base for future scholarship and research. Now, if we think back about the previous 9 slides and the too fast move over the 25 images they contain, it should be no surprise to any of us that there really is a worldwide audience for this collection. That's well represented, I think, by the Google Analytics slide that shows where users have come from. It's much appreciated as a resource. And yet, I have to say, it's appreciated in a small form. Currently, there are only about 40,000 of the images that are available in the online site. And some of you will know that through ArtStore, there's another 11,000 images that are available. But our goal is really to open up in collaboration with Susan and John as widely as possible this particular collection for discovery and make that discovery as transparent as possible. As I mentioned, the worldwide audience is diverse. Here we've got some examples of the kinds of users, their different objectives as they come to use the Huntington collection. But I hope you'll see that from the very beginning, John and Susan have seen as fundamentally important for their project the use of the images that they've collected well beyond art history. This is critically important as they've come this far. It's even more important, I would say, as we think about the future of the collection. And how does that happen? How does this set of images become available for access, for use, deployment, redeployment in the different intellectual spheres? And the answer, at least in part, is having extraordinarily detailed and solid metadata. So with that, I can turn to my dear colleague from the Visual Resource Center, Bridget Madden.
All right, thank you, Jim. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. So Jim just gave us a walk through the Huntington Archive, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to try to do to create access to this wonderful archive. The field notes that the Huntingtons and their team took during their 40 years of building this archive are the initial source of the metadata for the collection. There is an existing FileMaker database documenting some of the Huntington archive, but it's an esoteric database, and we want to move forward with making a really robust and authoritative catalog of the collection. So what we're going to do is use a cataloging utility that's also based in FileMaker Pro. It's called VCAT. And this is a free open source database that runs in FileMaker Pro that complies to the VRA Core 4 metadata schema. We'll also be using the cataloging guidelines set forth by Cataloging Cultural Objects. So these might be resources that could be of interest to you if you work with visual material. The Visual Resources Association, a quick plug, they're a great professional community that supports many of the tools that we're using for this particular project. The foundation of VCAT and VRA Core is a work to image relationship. Here's a screenshot here of what our cataloging utility looks like. The idea is that you would catalog the work once. So here's an example from Borobudur. And then you can attach all of the image records of that site to the work record, and they will inherit all of the information. So it's a great way to be consistent and efficient. For example, the Huntingtons have 8,000 photographs of Borobudur, so we only have to enter the site information once. But then the database also allows us to include really image-specific level cataloging in the image record, and VCAT unites both the site and the image record for one complete, robust data record. We do need to be mindful of spelling issues and transliterations. I know we've talked about that with a few of the other projects this weekend. So to help us do this work and to take care of the spelling issues and technical versus common use terms, that kind of thing, we're relying on controlled vocabularies from the Getty, the Library of Congress, Liebert, and other sources that are important to the field. Luckily, VCAT and Luna support Unicode representation of various scripts, so we could include different scripted languages in addition to English translations and transliterations if we wanted. And as part of our cataloging efforts, we're considering contributing new and updated terms to the Getty vocabulary program. We haven't worked out the details yet, but we want to make sure that the knowledge generated from this project can contribute to the authority file that's so widely used by other institutions and archives supporting image-based material. And of course, being consistent across different sites is a challenge for an archive that has hundreds of thousands of images. But luckily, the VCAT structure and our metadata schema and data content standards will help keep us consistent. Eventually, we plan to present the complete data records along with the images in a Luna database. We have a small test collection that's publicly available in Luna now. Luna is a proprietary image database that we use at the University of Chicago. And doing all of this work to standardize the metadata lets us think about a future phase of the project using linked open data, which as we know, relies on standardized authority files, and the structure of VCAT has underlying authority tables that ingest the information from these archives and point back to it with ref IDs. There is a tool developed by the VRA community called the VRA XML Transform tool, where we could take the data from VCAT as a CSV file and feed it through this tool, which would generate validating XML, which we could then feed into a project using linked open data. So this sets us up for thinking about future projects like that. Colleagues in our library are currently working on a project using linked open data, a tusk collection of 19th century photographs from the Middle East. And that's the scope of that project is a few hundred. So it's a much more manageable tusk collection instead of the Huntington Archive, which has a few 100,000. So we're excited to see where this linked open data tusk goes and how we might be able to apply it to the Huntington Archive. And to keep talking about the future of the collection, I'm going to turn it back to Jim.
I should have mentioned earlier on that I was channeling Susan Huntington. She's unfortunately not able to be with us today because of a family medical requirement. Yeah, the portion that I'm really excited about, in addition to the collection, of course, itself and all the work that we're doing, is the future prospects. It's wonderful to look forward and think about how linked open data provides, to go back, Sumati, to your presentation and the Mitchell reference, provides a passport in many ways, or let's say a passport that has tucked into it a CV. It's the documentation that's necessary for images to be on the move. And that's where we're going. And as you've so nicely described this, I think, Bridget, it's linked open data that's going to help facilitate this. It also is going to be possible for us, we imagine, in the fairly near future to make use of GIS approaches so that one's going to be able to navigate by going in time and place, begin with an image, move, and see what other images are available in a place or across time, see how images have traveled. It's also quite interesting to think about the metadata that's not yet accommodated within the Huntington Archive presentation through VCAT and Luna. I know that Susan and John are both keenly interested that we should take this marvelously deep information that they've collected about genre and to make that available for people's use more broadly in academic purposes, that is teaching and research. And finally, let me just say that we are intending to use the experience, the marvelous experience we're gaining in the collaboration with the Huntingtons, to open up a repository that can be the recipient of the visual resources developed by many of you, but also by people elsewhere who have been in the field, have taken photographs, and incorporate that using the firm platform that's been established. So what does linked open data do for us? Here, let me just take a moment to give you one or two examples. We've been talking about linked open data. I don't think there have been any concrete examples. Let me begin with something that I hope somebody who's participating by live streaming will be aware of, and that's my colleague Bronwyn Bledsoe at Cornell. Bronwyn first encountered the earliest of the known documentation of any of the Nepali king installations. This was thanks to the British Pate site. Many of you will know that, news clips that have been digitized. Fortunately, she was able to find a 1956 newsreel that contained Mahendra's installation as a king. This took place in a temple in Kathmandu. Almost certainly, although I haven't checked this, that is going to be represented by images in the Huntington collection. Those can be linked through linked open data, and one could flow them in a semi-seamless way in the hopefully near-term future to the texts of what one assumes would be the Rajasuya that was used as part of the installation of the king. And all of that may be possible to interlink with various other inscriptional information that's present at these sites. So you can imagine with Good, thank you. With the visualization that was very nicely presented for us with texts yesterday afternoon, it's possible to think about visualizations that can take place by bringing together these resources and allowing them to play together in an effective fashion or be discoverable through the means of linked open data. A very quick note, we're now in linked open data's year number 12. It was unfortunately a very long time ago that Tim Berners-Lee had come up with this notion, and we have yet to have very many good examples of browsers that make this possible, or examples of how linked open data can actually function. It's striking to me that such a marvelous and really profound concept can have taken so long to develop, but we are committed to work on it. And thank you.